Well, thanks for having me. Hope this benefits you in some way, this message. It's called The Wearisome Weight of Exceptionalism. The book we're studying right now in the Admiration series is The Road to Character by David Brooks. And in it, he tells a story of a drive home after a day's work. He's listening to an old broadcast of a program called Command Performance, which was a variety show sent out to World War II soldiers during the war. Brooks shares that he was listening to the episode when the moderator, Bing Crosby, finds out that we had just won the war in Europe. Crosby stops everything and says after a pause, "I guess all anyone can do is thank God it's over. Our deep down feeling is one of humility." There was no chest thumping, just humility. Later, Ernie Pyle, a war correspondent, says, "We won this war because our men are brave and because of Russia, England, and China. We did not win it because destiny created us better than all other people. I hope that in victory we are more grateful than proud." Anyway, Brooks pulls up in his driveway, turns off his car, comes in the house, turns on the TV, and at that moment he sees a linebacker tackle a guy for only a 2-yard gain. The defensive player jumps up and does a celebratory dance in front of the camera, and it occurs to Brooks that this football player is celebrating his insignificant tackle more than Bing Crosby and Ernie Pyle did in victory in the largest war in the history of humanity. Somewhere in the last 75 years, America has lost track of that humility, that Ernie Pyle, Bing Crosby generation type humility. Brooks uses the story to highlight how big our self-love, our self-aggrandizement, and self-promotion are, and how little our humility is these days. I know a guy who wears a t-shirt that says, "USA 2-0, undefeated in world wars." The football player and the Friends t-shirt are small signs that something has changed in our culture over the last 75 years. We're losing our humility, which is to say we're losing our soul. As people, instead of humility, we have a lot of chest thumping these days. And the empty drumbeat is, we're an exceptional country, an exceptional people, an exceptional economy, an exceptional stock market. We're just simply exceptional. But I'm starting to wonder that maybe the deepest problem in our country, and maybe within our species, is that we keep telling ourselves we're exceptional. The tendency in nearly every level of our existence is to think that we're somehow exceptional. It's bred into us from the beginning. We compare ourselves to others constantly looking for ways to prove that we're superior to others. We do this from our own personal narratives that we construct within ourselves about ourselves, all the way up to our collective narrative as a society. This isn't new. We've done this perhaps from the day one of our species. Tribes have called themselves the people, and everyone else was the others or the cannibals. The desire for exclusive exceptionality, where we separate ourselves from everyone else and claim that our value is somehow greater than the next group, is seen at nearly every level of our existence. It extends to how many groups have claimed that they have exclusive rights to God, down to the level of why my local high school is exceptional and yours isn't. And I know that last one sounds corny, but I've spent a good deal of time constructing and crafting a narrative about why my local high school, where I teach, is somehow exceptional. But there's something about it that's starting to bother me. I thought that these kids needed a narrative about how they were part of something outstanding and exceptional. I thought that that belief would translate into something positive for their identity. But I'm not so sure these kids need these narratives. On a larger level, I'm not sure that younger people are buying or feeling the narratives about our country's exceptionalism anymore. As a kid, I felt this country's exceptionalism. I believed very strongly as a kid that our country was on the right side of history. When Bruce Jenner won the decathlon in the bicentennial year, 1976, my eyes filled with pride, and the national anthem gave me goosebumps. I'm not so sure that young people feel that anymore, nor do they think that we're on the right side of history. Young people are very quick to point out that this country has separated families and locked up children. They no longer believe that we're on the right side of history. But for us adults, it's not so easy to ditch this notion of exceptionality. It seems like a part of our very identity as a people. We may be able to get over the exceptionalism thing when it comes to high schools, but we're not getting over exceptionalism in a lot of other areas. It's as if we're so fragile and insecure that we need these narratives about our exceptionalism to feel valid. In fact, many are so defensive about it that to even slightly question the narrative of our collective exceptionalism is often considered a form of hate speech or treason. And don't get me wrong, there are some amazing things that this country has done. Going to the moon, Hoover Dam, Golden Gate Bridge, One World Trade Center. Aside from the moon, other countries have made bigger dams and bigger bridges and taller skyscrapers. So is this what we should keep hanging our hat on? The biggest this or that? At some point, can't we grow up and stop the kindergarten, my dad's stronger than your dad thing? In many ways, we're victims of our own success. As David Brooks points out, success leads to the greatest failure, which is pride. And failure leads to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, Brooks says, you have to forget yourself. I want to get to the gospel reading today, but what does the gospel mean if we haven't seen our failures? If we're still full of pride, still focused on what about me, and still falling back on those old notions of exceptionalism, where everything's okay, then we miss the possibility of what this failure offers us, namely humility, learning, and I would add moral and spiritual growth, along with joy. Here we are in a 1968, 1936, 1918, all rolled into one. Is there anyone out there who could pridefully call 2020 an exceptional success? Where do we go with all this collapse, decline, death, and misery? I suggest that we go back to a generation not so far back there who faced these challenges, and I'm talking about my grandparents' generation. My grandparents were born in 1880, 1893, 1901, and 1902. They saw massive world wars. They saw a global pandemic. They saw a Great Depression. They saw the cultural and racial turmoil of the 1960s. And what got them through all this? Well, on the surface, it's going to seem very plain, but maybe that's the point. My grandparents made big families because they needed help. There was a lot of work to do on the farm. To take a farm tucked in the marginal hills on the eastern flank of the Little Sioux River and eke out a life took some hands. They just didn't have a button to do all that work. 160 acres of corn was not much, but it still was a lot if you had to pick it by hand. Kids were a cog in the family enterprise. Each kid had some part in the family farm, milking cows, slopping pigs, cooking on the cook stove, making sure that there were plenty of cobs by the stove, canning food from the orchard, and in fall, picking the corn. The family farm operation didn't bend itself around a child's Little League schedule. No, the children were bent around the daily schedule of the farm. The farm was big. You were small. Get over yourself. To this generation, exceptionalism wasn't taught. They were too busy to worry about being exceptional, which maybe has something to do with why they were actually exceptional. None of the people in our admiration series, from Buddha, Muhammad, St. Francis, Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Mother Teresa, John Lewis, Jimmy Carter, ever thought they were exceptional. You don't become exceptional by thinking you're exceptional. And herein lies one of the greatest falsehoods in education and parenting in the last 40 years. We've thought that if these kids think of themselves as exceptional, then they'll become exceptional. But when we study exceptional people who have shaped human life and human history, we find that they're repulsed by this line of thinking. You don't become exceptional by thinking you're exceptional. You become exceptional by doing your duty so well and being so busy washing the feet of society that you forget to hold up your exceptionality. That, by the way, is the gospel, but more on that later. It's funny how both sides of the political divide, we both recognize this me-centric problem in child rearing. We criticize it while we're on our way to the travel league baseball game 100 miles from home. It's been 75 years of meanness, me this, me that. Much of the leadership in this country is about as far away from that turn of the last century generation as can possibly be. JFK was born just over 100 years ago, but his mindset was light years from where we are today. Instead, JFK's famous motto today would sadly be, ask not what you can do for your country, but ask what your country can do for you. And we'd probably be fine in our self-indulgent ways, but we happen to be in a 1918, 1936, and a 1968 all at the same time. Our response has been unimaginably predictable. What about me? What about my rights? What about my paycheck? And as long as that's okay, everything's okay. As long as me and my people haven't died from COVID, well, heck, it probably doesn't even exist. Because the only real experience that counts in this world is mine. And if that stuff isn't a part of my experience, well, maybe it doesn't even exist. We've become that narcissistic. And we now have leadership in this country, and on both sides I'm talking, comprised of narcissistic, spoiled, rotten little brats. How does the saying go? It takes a first generation to build it, the second generation to enjoy it, and the third generation to destroy it. We have a third generation type leadership in this country. We've had more tearing down in the last years than building. 75 years of self-indulgent prosperity has led us to this moment. Our prosperity has not made us as tough as my grandparents' generation. It isn't surprising that we're not equipped to deal with the challenges of this moment, seemingly so. And one of the challenges of this moment is now I have to do something to protect you. And that runs totally contrary to the way we've been conditioned in this nation for the last 75 years. To deal with this might mean coming to terms with our narrative of exceptionalism. It could entail admitting some weaknesses in the character of our nation. Instead of reflecting on how we've become so torn apart as a nation and changing course, there's a concerted effort to just brush all this under the rug and cling to the old narrative that we're exceptional. Now there's a push for patriotic education. Today, to even question exceptionalism is almost considered treasonous. Let me say, I love this country. But my love for this country includes the scars, the warts, and the wrinkles. My love for this country doesn't need a plastic Barbie doll version of the story. I can still love this country even when it looks like a Dorothy Lang 1930 photo. I can still, as Rabbi Abraham Heschel once wrote, religion without indignation at political evils is impossible. To speak about God and remain silent about Vietnam is blasphemous. He wrote that in the 60s. There is a way to hold on to things we love while simultaneously using our critical thinking skills. It's what David Brooks and Richard Rohr would call growing up. If we are exceptional in all, it almost certainly runs in both directions, good and bad. At times, this country is capable of being exceptional at cruelty. Ever wonder why California doesn't have many Native American tribes? A part of that reason is because the government in Sacramento used to pay $5 a scalp, man, woman, child of any Native American. It was like beaver pelts were brought in like a fur trade. This government promoted taking pock shocks out of trains at bison out of boredom just to watch them fall dead. We've been in the business of separating children from their families and putting them in cages. And now we've lost track of the parents. We're a nation that now creates orphans. It doesn't take a prophet to say this is wrong. It's just simple, obvious, and exceptionally cruel and wrong. But we are also a nation of values. Beautiful values. Values that we have not lived up to, but we have had people who have struggled in the face of overwhelming odds to help this country live up to its values. And that is the part of our history that I am very proud of. Now, let's talk, that's a lot of talk about our country. Let's look at our scripture reading for today. because it gets to the central notion of Christianity. It runs completely counter to our notion of exceptionalism. We are a people who ascribe to this notion of a purposeful initiator. Stephen Hawking, I believe, said that if the theory of gravity is true, that the universe would expand out and then slow and eventually come back and collapse in on itself, and eventually converge on one point and blow itself up again like an accordion constantly, because mass attracts itself, and that the universe works on that kind of a scale. Let me just try in vain to put some scope and scale to this notion of this creator God for the purposes of the point I want to make. We inhabit a universe that is so big that when you look up at the stars, you're witnessing millions of years of history. That's because it's taken light millions of years to get here. And that light is moving at 86,282 miles a second. That's over 500 million miles an hour. Think of how many seconds there are in 23 million years. And then think that every one of those seconds represents 186,000 miles. It's a big place. Imagine, for instance, the distance we are from the Whirlpool galaxy. It's 23 million miles away, light years away. That galaxy alone is 76,000 light years across. And it is a speck out there that we can't even see except through telescope. This is a big place. I've heard that you can point in any direction, and somewhere back there is a galaxy. And in each one of those galaxies is enough stars to fill the sand on our beaches. We're talking about something unfathomably big here, right? And that great big out there we'll call the Creator God chose to become one of us. Chose to become limited to a very tiny, fragile space at a particular time in history. And to do what? To say, hey, everybody, I'm exceptional. You should be in awe of me. Nope, that's not how the story goes. On the night in which he was betrayed, this guy who plays the universe like an accordion took a bowl of water and a washcloth and started washing dirt off his friend's feet. On the night in which he was betrayed, he healed a man's ear. An ear that came from a man who was arresting him on false charges. When he was dying for a crime that he didn't commit, he spent the last moments of his life forgiving. And when they paraded him in Jerusalem on a donkey to overthrow an empire, he wasn't interested in that. He had a bigger revolution in mind. One of radical humility. Where the greatest aren't the greatest. Where the greatest are the least. The maker of stars, comets, galaxies, black holes, supernovas, quasars, down to ants' kneecaps and butterfly wings, could certainly have made a case for exceptionalism, right? If anybody is exceptional, it is this man. Except what does he do? He washes dirt off of people's feet, deals with bloody ears laying on the ground, feeds the hungry, heals the sick. From start to finish, he is consistent in his humility, empathy, and concern about the down and out. For instance, when at the onset of his ministry, he purposely declared the year of Jubilee. In other words, he associates himself with structural redistribution of wealth and social justice. At the same time, he advocates for personal renewal and repentance. So the Creator God comes to earth as a little speck of sand in a vast ocean, takes up residence in a frail human body at a specific time and place in history to say what? I'm exceptional? No. You should be impressed? No. No. It was to communicate a different value system. The least of these, the ones who wash feet and are busy about putting other people back together. Yeah, that's what I'm about, he said. And that's the gospel. To me, the gospel is not a fire insurance privatization plan for personal security after death based on ascribing to the right dogma while billions go off into hell. The gospel to me is really about washing feet. Because here's the deal. Here's the deal. Washing feet is the pathway to joy in this life. Recently, I've been reading about the prophets, and I've heard that all the civil rights leaders used to carry around a copy of Abraham Heschel's The Prophets. And the one thing that is apparent throughout that book is the idea that you better get humble or you're going to get humbled. Francis Perkins once said, if you can't learn humility, God will teach you by humiliation. But seeking humility runs counter to our whole basis of our culture. Our meritocracy is based on rewarding personal drive for individual advancement. But our religion is based on something else. A personal sacrifice for collective good. One is measured in dollars for self, and the other is measured in terms of love for others. One leaves us empty, and one fills our souls. When we look at Jesus through our cultural values, Jesus' resume looks actually pretty weak. He supposedly helped a few random people, made some people, outsiders, feel good about themselves, but really, what did he do to make a difference? Well, in economic terms, not much. In political terms, not much. In many ways, Jesus was an outcast. He was a loser. He sponged off other people's work. The place where he had his Last Supper and the place where he was buried wasn't even his. He was nearly homeless, aside from some friends who chipped in. And for goodness sakes, he was a registered criminal. I mean, his only role was religious leader, and at that, he had his most epic failure. He was rejected totally by the religious community of that day. And here we are, still talking about this guy. In many ways, if we look to Jesus as an ego-driven first half of life go-getter who created jobs and was a successful entrepreneur, yeah, he's pretty bad. He is in no way exceptional. But when we step into the second half of life, where Jesus lived and where Rohr and Brooks talk about, and then we see that we've spent so much of our lives trying to prove ourselves to others, that we're somehow exceptional, unique, special, based on tangible evidence. We live and breathe in a meritocracy, and we are often unaware of its effect on us. Jesus was radically different. He didn't create a system based on merit. Instead, he advocated for an economy of grace. And when we come to that second half of life, we realize that Jesus spoke some major truth when he said, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his own soul?" We often interpret that through dualistic lens of either eternal bliss or eternal damnation, but I think Jesus was talking about the tragedy of losing your soul in this life. You see it happening in our culture. We are slowly losing our empathy, which is to say we're slowly losing our soul. And look at how that is affecting the quality of life in this life. Through the example of Jesus, we see a way forward. With Jesus, we see a path called radical humility. God the bushwasher, God the ear healer, God dying unjustly and still forgiving. And this is the gospel, the good news. The good news is that we can serve. The good news is that we can love our neighbors. We can be about doing good for others. And in that service, in that spirit of radical humility, that attitude of radical empathy, in that attitude of radical forgiveness, life takes on a new joy. And that's the gospel. So here we are, a people who claim the creator God of the universe became a human who sought to be the lowest servant, who tirelessly fed the hungry and healed the sick. And now here we are. Our country is sick and broken. And this is our moment. This is our chance to practice radical humility of Jesus and give up touting narratives of exceptionalism and, like our ancestors, just go out and milk the cows. No one in those days said, "Wow, you're the best milker ever." They didn't need that. They just got in the barn and they milked the cows. We're called to another stage of life and enlightenment, where we are no longer have to separate ourselves by proving our merit. Rather, it is time to practice radical humility that finds solace in coming down off our high horse and living into solidarity, service, and community. Not because it'll get us to heaven, but because it is a pathway to making heaven here on earth, which is the essence of Jesus' prayer and what the good news of his message was all about.